The Grand Imperial Hotel shimmered beneath thousands of crystal lights as the most exclusive charity banquet in the country, prepared to welcome more than 400 distinguished guests. Billionaires, senators, Fortune 500 executives, celebrities, and world-renowned philanthropists stepped from luxury cars onto the red carpet, while television reporters described the evening as the largest charity gala ever organized in New York. Every ticket cost more than $50,000, yet every seat had been reserved months in advance. At the center of the celebration stood Jonathan Pierce, the charismatic CEO of the Pierce Foundation, whose billion-dollar fundraising campaign had become the talk of every major news network. Tonight he intended to announce a record-breaking donation that would permanently place his foundation among the most influential charitable organizations in America. Backstage, assistants rushed between dressing rooms carrying schedules, speeches, and last-minute contracts while photographers waited for Jonathan's grand entrance. Everything had been planned to perfection. Every flower arrangement, every orchestra performance, every gourmet course, every luxury decoration had been paid for by one mysterious sponsor whose identity remained completely anonymous. Even Jonathan himself had never met the benefactor. The only thing he knew was that every invoice had already been paid in full through a private trust. The donor had refused interviews, publicity, and even a seat on stage. Jonathan often joked that whoever the mystery billionaire was, he clearly hated attention. Outside the magnificent ballroom, a yellow taxi quietly stopped beside the long line of Rolls-Royces and Bentleys. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. An elderly black man slowly emerged carrying a worn leather briefcase that had clearly traveled with him for decades. His name was Elijah Brooks. He was 68 years old, neatly dressed in an old charcoal gray suit whose fabric had faded with time, but remained perfectly pressed. His polished shoes were old but spotless. His silver hair was closely trimmed, and his calm eyes quietly observed the luxury surrounding him, without envy or excitement. Elijah thanked the taxi driver, paid the fare with exact cash, picked up his briefcase, and slowly walked toward the ballroom entrance. Wealthy guests passed him without a second glance, assuming he was either hotel staff or someone who had wandered into the wrong event. At the entrance, a young hostess greeted him politely. "Good evening, sir. May I see your invitation?" Elijah smiled warmly and reached inside his briefcase. Instead of producing a digital QR code like every other guest, he carefully unfolded an old cream-colored invitation with gold lettering. The hostess frowned slightly before scanning her tablet several times. She searched again, then once more. "I'm sorry, sir," she said nervously. "I don't see your name on the main guest list." Elijah nodded calmly. "Please check the special invitation list." Before she could respond, Amanda Collins, the elegant director of public relations for the Pierce Foundation, approached after finishing a live television interview. Wearing a sparkling white evening gown and expensive diamond jewelry, Amanda immediately noticed the elderly black man standing quietly at the reception desk. Her eyes moved from his worn suit to his old briefcase before settling on the paper invitation in his hand. A faint smile crossed her face. "Is there a problem?" she asked. The hostess answered softly. "His invitation isn't showing in the system." Amanda gently took the invitation from Elijah's hands without asking permission. She looked at it for only a few seconds before laughing quietly. "This invitation design hasn't been used in years." Several nearby guests turned toward the conversation with curious expressions. Amanda looked directly at Elijah. "Where exactly did you get this invitation?" Elijah answered with complete honesty. "The gentleman who invited me handed it to me himself." Amanda smiled politely, though her tone carried unmistakable sarcasm. "Really? And who might that be?" Elijah looked toward the grand ballroom doors before answering. "An old friend." A few nearby guests quietly laughed. Amanda folded her arms. "Sir, tonight's banquet isn't open to the public." Elijah nodded respectfully. "I understand. Then perhaps you've mistaken this for another event." Elijah slowly shook his head. No. I've waited many years for this evening. Amanda sighed impatiently and signaled toward two security guards standing nearby. Gentlemen. They immediately approached. Elijah never stepped backward. He simply stood quietly holding his briefcase while television photographers on the red carpet slowly turned their cameras toward the growing commotion. Amanda lowered her voice but made no effort to hide her contempt. This event is being broadcast nationwide. I can't have someone pretending to know our anonymous sponsor. Elijah looked at her peacefully. I'm not pretending. Amanda smiled. Then you expect me to believe someone important personally invited you? Elijah answered softly. No. He paused before adding, I expected him to remember. Those simple words caused several guests to laugh openly. One businessman whispered loudly enough for others to hear, every charity gala attracts people looking for free food. More laughter followed. Elijah remained silent. At that exact moment, Jonathan Pierce entered the lobby after greeting several international donors outside. Amanda immediately walked toward him. Jonathan, everything is under control. Just a gentleman with an old invitation, trying to enter. Jonathan glanced briefly toward Elijah. His eyes stopped for only a second on the elderly black man's faded suit before returning to Amanda. Handle it quickly, he said. The media is waiting. Elijah quietly spoke before Jonathan disappeared through the ballroom doors. Congratulations, Jonathan. The CEO stopped for the briefest moment. Something about the voice sounded strangely familiar. He turned halfway toward Elijah, but failed to recognize the face standing before him. He simply nodded politely and continued walking inside without another word. Elijah watched the ballroom doors close. His expression never changed. He slowly placed the invitation back into his briefcase and whispered almost to himself, so, even after all these years, you still don't recognize me. Hidden beneath the invitation, inside the briefcase, rested a sealed folder containing every contract, payment receipt, and bank transfer proving that the quiet elderly black man standing alone outside the ballroom had secretly paid every single dollar for the billion-dollar banquet taking place. Jonathan Pierce disappeared into the ballroom without looking back. The towering golden doors closed behind him as applause erupted inside the magnificent hall, where hundreds of influential guests waited for the evening's celebration to begin. Outside, Elijah Brooks remained standing exactly where he was, holding his worn leather briefcase with the same calm expression he had worn since stepping out of the taxi. Amanda Collins crossed her arms impatiently. Well, I believe that's settled. Elijah looked at her politely. May I ask one favor before I leave? Amanda sighed. What is it now? Elijah smiled gently. Please tell Mr. Pierce that Elijah Brooks came to keep a promise. Amanda laughed quietly. Mr. Pierce doesn't have time to meet every stranger claiming they know him. Several nearby guests smiled in agreement. One wealthy businessman adjusted his cufflinks and muttered, some people really will invent any story just to get inside a luxury event. Elijah heard every word but never responded. Instead, he calmly opened his briefcase, just enough to place the old invitation safely back inside. As he did, a thick sealed envelope bearing the words payment authorization briefly became visible before disappearing beneath several carefully organized documents. Amanda noticed only the edge of the envelope. What's inside that case? She asked suspiciously. Elijah answered honestly. Something that belongs to Jonathan. Then let security inspect it. One of the older security guards hesitated before stepping forward. Sir, would you mind opening your briefcase completely? Elijah smiled kindly. Not at all. He slowly handed it over. The guard carefully examined the contents. Inside were neatly folded clothes, an old fountain pen, a pair of reading glasses, several faded photographs, a leather notebook filled with handwritten notes, and a sealed document folder tied together with a blue ribbon. There were no electronics, no expensive gifts, no weapons, and nothing remotely suspicious. The younger guard picked up one of the old photographs before stopping. It showed 2 young black men and 3 young white men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of an unfinished community center, nearly 40 years earlier. One of the young men looked remarkably like Elijah. Another looked surprisingly similar to a young Jonathan Pierce. Before the guard could study it further, Elijah gently accepted the photograph back with a warm smile. "Old memories," he said softly. The older guard immediately apologized and carefully returned everything to the briefcase. Amanda, however, remained unconvinced. "Escort Mr. Brooks outside the property." Elijah looked toward the ballroom doors one last time. "I promised someone I would attend tonight," Amanda answered firmly. "And I'm promising you that you won't." At that exact moment, a young catering employee hurried through the entrance carrying a stack of expensive crystal dessert plates. One plate slipped from his hands, shattered across the marble floor, and sent fragments sliding in every direction. The terrified young man froze. Before anyone else reacted, Elijah immediately knelt down to help gather the broken pieces. "Careful," he said warmly. "Don't cut yourself." The young employee looked embarrassed. "Sir, you don't have to help me." Elijah smiled while collecting another shard of glass. "Sometimes helping is faster than judging." Before the young man could answer, the banquet supervisor stormed over. "What happened?" Without waiting for an explanation, he began shouting. "Do you know how expensive those plates are? If you're going to be careless, you shouldn't be working here." The young employee lowered his head, clearly humiliated. Elijah quietly stood and faced the supervisor. It was an accident. The supervisor barely glanced at him. "This doesn't concern you." Elijah nodded respectfully and returned to collecting the final pieces of broken glass. Several wealthy guests walked around the mess without offering assistance. Some even appeared amused by the scene. The older security guard silently watched Elijah help the employee clean every fragment before placing the broken pieces safely into a disposal container. Something about the old man's quiet kindness began to trouble him. Most people wearing expensive suits ignored employees. Yet the only guest dressed modestly had been the first person to help. Inside the ballroom, Jonathan Pierce stood backstage reviewing his opening speech while television producers counted down to the live broadcast. Tonight, he rehearsed confidently, "We celebrate generosity, compassion, and the extraordinary power of giving." Outside, Elijah gently patted the nervous young employee on the shoulder. "Don't let one mistake convince you that you don't belong here." The young man managed a grateful smile. "Thank you, sir." Elijah nodded and picked up his briefcase once again. Amanda glanced impatiently toward the ballroom entrance. "Please escort him outside." Just before either security guard moved, a black sedan quietly pulled to the curb. The driver immediately stepped out and opened the rear passenger door. An elderly African-American woman, dressed in a simple navy coat, slowly emerged, assisted by a younger aide carrying several locked document cases. The older security guard immediately straightened his posture. "Mrs. Eleanor Carter," he whispered. Amanda's expression instantly changed. Eleanor Carter was one of the country's most respected civil rights attorneys and served as trustee for several billion-dollar charitable foundations. She almost never attended public events. Amanda hurried forward with a welcoming smile. "Mrs. Carter, we're honored to have you." Eleanor acknowledged her politely, but continued walking without stopping. Instead of heading toward the ballroom or greeting Jonathan Pierce, she walked directly toward Elijah Brooks. Her eyes filled with emotion. She reached both hands toward him and smiled warmly. "Elijah." Elijah smiled back. "Eleanor." Without hesitation, the two embraced like lifelong friends. Amanda stood frozen. Reporters immediately pointed their cameras toward the unexpected reunion. Eleanor gently stepped back and looked at Elijah's face. "I was beginning to worry you weren't coming." Elijah smiled. "I made a promise." Eleanor nodded. "You always keep your promises." She then slowly turned toward Amanda before asking one simple question that caused the entire lobby to fall completely silent. "Why," she asked calmly, Is the man who paid for this entire banquet still standing outside? The entire entrance hall fell into stunned silence. Eleanor Carter's question echoed through the marble lobby, while every television camera instantly turned toward the elderly black man standing quietly beside the reception desk. Amanda Collins blinked in disbelief. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" Eleanor looked directly at her, her expression calm but unwavering. "I asked why Mr. Elijah Brooks, the man who personally financed every dollar of tonight's banquet, is still standing outside." The reporters immediately began whispering to one another. Camera operators hurried closer, sensing the biggest story of the evening unfolding before them. Amanda forced an awkward smile. "There must be some misunderstanding." Eleanor slowly shook her head. "No misunderstanding." She nodded toward one of her assistants. "Bring me the documents." The young assistant stepped forward carrying a locked leather portfolio. He carefully opened it and removed a thick stack of payment contracts, wire transfer confirmations, and notarized financial agreements. Every page carried the same signature at the bottom. Elijah Brooks. Amanda's confident expression immediately began to disappear. "That's impossible." Eleanor handed her the first document, invoice for the Grand Imperial Hotel, paid in full. She handed over another. The orchestra, paid in full. Another. The International Catering Company, paid in full. Another. The charity auction setup. Another. The television broadcast rights. Another. Security services. Another. Transportation for every guest. Every document bore Elijah's signature and the same private charitable trust. Amanda's hands began trembling. "Jonathan never told me." Eleanor interrupted gently. "Jonathan doesn't know." Confused whispers spread across the entrance hall. At that exact moment, Jonathan Pierce walked back into the lobby after noticing television crews abandoning the ballroom. He looked around in confusion before seeing Eleanor Carter. "Mrs. Carter." He smiled politely. "I'm honored you came." Eleanor acknowledged him with a nod before asking quietly, "Jonathan, have you ever met the anonymous donor funding tonight's gala?" Jonathan hesitated. "No." "Have you ever spoken to him?" "No." "Have you ever thanked him?" Jonathan slowly shook his head. "No." Eleanor stepped aside, revealing Elijah standing only a few feet away. "Then perhaps tonight is the perfect opportunity." Jonathan looked toward the elderly black man with confusion written across his face. He glanced briefly at the documents Amanda still held before looking back at Elijah. "You're saying," Eleanor answered for him, "every dollar that made this evening possible came from Mr. Brooks." Jonathan stared silently. "That can't be right." Eleanor calmly opened another folder. 387 separate payments. She pointed toward the signatures. Every one verified by federal banking records. Jonathan accepted the folder with uncertain hands. As he flipped through the pages, his breathing gradually slowed. Every payment matched perfectly. Every contract had already been settled weeks earlier. Every receipt led back to one charitable foundation, the Brooks Legacy Foundation. Jonathan whispered almost to himself, "Why would someone do this anonymously?" Elijah smiled gently. "Because the children the money helps don't care who paid." Those simple words struck the room harder than any accusation. Jonathan looked up for the first time and truly studied the elderly man standing before him, the old charcoal gray suit, the worn briefcase, the calm eyes. Something deep inside his memory stirred. It wasn't recognition yet. Only the strange feeling that he had seen those eyes many years ago. Before he could speak again, one of the hotel's accountants hurried through the ballroom doors carrying a laptop. "Mr. Pierce," he called nervously. "You need to see this immediately." He placed the laptop on a nearby reception desk and opened the foundation's financial records. "We've just verified the payment history." Jonathan leaned closer. The accountant clicked through dozens of transactions. Every expense for the evening had been transferred from the same charitable trust. Then he opened another folder labeled Emergency Donation History. Jonathan frowned. What's this? The accountant looked confused. I don't know why it's linked to tonight's payments. He clicked the first file. The screen displayed a hospital donation made 12 years earlier. Donor, Brooks Legacy Foundation. Another file appeared. Scholarship Fund, Brooks Legacy Foundation. Another, Hurricane Disaster Relief, Brooks Legacy Foundation. Another, Housing Assistance for Veterans, Brooks Legacy Foundation. Another, Childhood Cancer Research, Brooks Legacy Foundation. Jonathan looked at Elijah in disbelief. How much have you donated? Elijah answered honestly. I stopped counting years ago. The accountant quietly swallowed before speaking again. Sir? Jonathan looked at him. According to IRS public charity filings, he hesitated. The Brooks Legacy Foundation has quietly donated more than $6.4 billion over the past 32 years. Gasps erupted throughout the lobby. Television reporters immediately began broadcasting the revelation live. One anchor spoke directly into the camera. The anonymous philanthropist responsible for one of the largest charitable foundations in American history has just been identified. Jonathan remained frozen. His eyes slowly moved from the financial records to Elijah's calm face. If you've done all this, his voice trembled. Why have I never heard your name? Elijah smiled softly. Because I wasn't trying to build my reputation. He looked toward the ballroom filled with wealthy guests. I was trying to build opportunities for people who would never know mine. Complete silence returned. Just then, the ballroom lights suddenly dimmed. A voice echoed through the building's sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, may we have your attention? Every guest looked toward the enormous LED screen at the front of the ballroom. Instead of displaying Jonathan Piercy's prepared presentation, the screen suddenly switched to an old black and white photograph. 5 young volunteers stood together outside a small neighborhood community center nearly 40 years earlier. One of them was a young Elijah Brooks. Standing beside him was a teenage boy wearing worn jeans and a volunteer badge. Jonathan Pierce slowly stared at the image. The color drained from his face. He took one trembling step toward the screen before whispering words only those closest could hear. No! He looked back at Elijah, his voice barely audible. It can't be. Jonathan Pierce remained frozen before the giant LED screen as the old black and white photograph filled every corner of the ballroom. More than 400 guests slowly turned toward the image, trying to understand why the confident billionaire host had suddenly lost all color in his face. The photograph showed 5 young volunteers standing outside a small neighborhood community center during the winter of 1988. The building looked unfinished, its windows covered with plywood, while children smiled around the volunteers, despite the obvious poverty surrounding them. Jonathan stepped closer to the screen. His breathing became uneven. Where did you find this photograph? Eleanor Carter answered quietly. It came from Mr. Brooks. Jonathan slowly turned toward Elijah. You were there. Elijah smiled gently. Yes. Jonathan pointed toward the teenage boy standing beside the young Elijah in the photograph. That's me. Elijah nodded. Yes. Complete silence filled the ballroom. Jonathan stared at the picture for several more seconds before memories he had buried for decades suddenly rushed back. He remembered the freezing winter after his father died. His mother working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. He remembered volunteering at a tiny neighborhood center because it was the only place that served free dinners after school. Most of all, he remembered one volunteer who always arrived before everyone else and left after everyone else. A quiet black man who fixed broken chairs, repaired leaking pipes, served meals, cleaned the kitchen, and somehow always knew which children needed extra food to take home. Jonathan whispered almost to himself, Mr. Elijah. Elijah smiled. Now you remember. Jonathan closed his eyes. You used to save me the last bowl of soup every Friday. Elijah laughed softly. You were always still hungry. Gentle laughter spread through the crowd. Jonathan's voice trembled. When my mother couldn't afford school books. He looked directly at Elijah. Someone left new books on our front porch. Elijah remained silent. Jonathan continued. When our apartment's heating broke in the middle of winter, his eyes filled with tears. Someone paid the repair bill anonymously. Elijah quietly looked toward the floor. Jonathan's breathing grew heavier. When I received my college acceptance letter but couldn't afford tuition. He stopped speaking altogether. Eleanor Carter gently stepped forward holding another sealed folder. You should probably see this. Jonathan accepted the folder with trembling hands. Inside rested copies of scholarship records nearly 30 years old. At the bottom of every page appeared one sentence. Anonymous educational grant approved. Beneath it appeared the same signature he had already seen throughout the evening. Elijah Brooks. Jonathan slowly looked up. You paid for my education. Elijah answered with his usual calm smile. It wasn't very much back then. Jonathan shook his head. It was everything. Reporters no longer interrupted. Camera operators quietly continued recording, while many wiped tears from their eyes. Jonathan carefully opened another document from the folder. It contained a letter written by the scholarship committee. Applicant demonstrates exceptional leadership, but lacks financial resources. Private donor requests complete anonymity. Jonathan looked toward Elijah again. Why didn't you ever tell me? Elijah shrugged gently. Would it have helped you study harder? Jonathan smiled through tears before quietly laughing. Probably not. Elijah nodded. Then there wasn't much point. The room remained silent. Jonathan looked once more at the old photograph on the giant screen. All these years, his voice cracked. I spent my life trying to become the kind of man who could help people the way that volunteer helped me. He slowly lowered his head. I never realized I was standing in front of him tonight. Elijah walked closer and gently placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. You did help people. Jonathan looked ashamed. Not tonight. Elijah smiled kindly. Everyone has moments they wish they could do over. Amanda Collins quietly stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. She looked directly at Elijah. Mr. Brooks. Her voice shook uncontrollably. I judged you because of your clothes. Elijah answered softly. Many people did. Amanda lowered her head. I treated you as though you didn't belong here. Elijah looked around the magnificent ballroom before quietly replying, sometimes the easiest way to learn what's inside a room is to walk into it looking like someone people expect to ignore. Those words left the entire audience speechless. At that moment, the ballroom orchestra stopped playing altogether. Every musician had quietly lowered their instruments while watching the extraordinary scene unfold. Jonathan slowly climbed onto the stage where his prepared speech still rested untouched on the podium. He looked across the hundreds of wealthy guests filling the ballroom before speaking into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice echoed throughout the hall. Tonight I plan to introduce the greatest philanthropist our foundation has ever worked with. He paused before smiling sadly. Instead, I've realized I was about to introduce the man who quietly shaped my entire life. Thunderous applause erupted throughout the ballroom. Many guests stood to their feet. Others remained seated in stunned silence. Jonathan turned toward Elijah. Would you please join me on stage? Elijah gently shook his head. I'd rather stay here. Jonathan smiled. Still avoiding the spotlight? Elijah laughed quietly. Old habits. Just then, one of Eleanor Carter's assistants hurried toward the stage carrying another sealed document case. His expression had suddenly become serious. Mrs. Carter, he whispered urgently. We've found the final file. Eleanor's smile disappeared. Are you certain? He nodded once. It was hidden behind the original trust documents. Jonathan looked between them. What final file? Eleanor accepted the envelope slowly. Across the front, written in faded handwriting, appeared only 6 words. Open only if Jonathan finds me. Eleanor looked toward Elijah in complete surprise. You wrote this 30 years ago. Elijah stared silently at the envelope. His calm expression slowly faded. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "I was hoping that letter would never be opened." The ballroom stood in complete silence as Eleanor Carter held the sealed envelope with both hands. Across the front, written in Elijah Brooks' unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words: "Open only if Jonathan finds me." Jonathan stared at the envelope, unable to understand what it meant. "You wrote that for me," Elijah slowly nodded. 30 years ago." Jonathan frowned. "Why?" Elijah remained silent for several moments before answering quietly. "Because I never wanted you to know who helped you unless you discovered it through your own character, not through my reputation." Eleanor looked toward Elijah. "The trust agreement says only Jonathan may open this letter." Jonathan accepted the envelope carefully. His hands trembled as he broke the old seal. The paper inside had yellowed with time, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. He unfolded the first page and began reading aloud. "Dear Jonathan, if you are reading this, then life has brought us together again. If you found me because someone introduced me as a wealthy donor, then please stop reading now. But if you found me because your own heart recognized something more important than wealth, then continue." Jonathan paused, looking at Elijah with confusion. Elijah simply smiled and gestured for him to keep reading. Jonathan continued, 30 years ago, you were a frightened 17-year-old boy who believed poverty would decide the rest of your life. Every Friday after serving dinner at the community center, you stayed behind to clean the tables even when nobody asked you to. One winter evening, I watched you quietly give your own meal to a younger child because you noticed he was hungrier than you. Jonathan's eyes widened. He had completely forgotten that moment. Elijah remembered every detail. Jonathan continued reading. That night, I realized something. Character always reveals itself when nobody is watching. I decided then that if I could help only one young person achieve their dreams, it would be you. Not because you needed money, but because you already possessed something money could never buy. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Jonathan's voice grew weaker. You thanked every volunteer. You respected every janitor. You carried chairs without being asked. You never believed any job was beneath you. I knew one day you would become successful. My only prayer was that success would never erase the kindness I first saw in that little community center. Jonathan stopped reading. Tears rolled freely down his face. He looked toward Elijah. I failed you tonight. Elijah shook his head gently. No. Jonathan looked confused. Elijah smiled warmly. You forgot me. He paused. But you never stopped helping people. Jonathan lowered his eyes. That doesn't excuse what happened. Elijah quietly replied, No, it doesn't. The honesty in those words filled the room with even greater emotion. Jonathan continued reading the second page. If you are reading this after treating me like a stranger, then I hope you don't waste time feeling ashamed. Shame changes nothing. Gratitude changes everything. Go back inside. Thank the people who prepare your meals before you eat them. Learn the names of the security guards who protect you every evening. Ask the maintenance workers how their families are doing. Remember birthdays. Celebrate ordinary victories. The greatest leaders are not remembered because powerful people respected them. They are remembered because ordinary people never forgot how they made them feel. Jonathan slowly lowered the page. Every employee standing throughout the ballroom looked toward him. Some smiled through tears. Others quietly nodded. The final page remained folded inside the envelope. Jonathan hesitated before opening it. At the top appeared only one sentence. There is one final truth I never told you. Jonathan's breathing slowed. He continued reading. The scholarship that paid for your university education was never my greatest investment in you. Jonathan looked puzzled. Years after you graduated, your mother became seriously ill. The doctors believed she needed an experimental surgery that your insurance refused to cover. You spent weeks searching for another solution while quietly preparing to sell your first company. Before it had even begun, Jonathan suddenly froze. That period had nearly destroyed him emotionally. His mother had survived after an anonymous donor paid for the operation just hours before the hospital canceled the procedure. For nearly 20 years, he had searched unsuccessfully for the identity of that donor. Jonathan's hands began shaking violently. He whispered, "No." His eyes continued reading the final paragraph. "I never wanted your mother to know who paid for her surgery, because I wanted her last years to be filled with gratitude instead of obligation. She deserved, not debt. If she ever asked you who saved her life, I hope you answered truthfully. Tell her kindness did." Jonathan could no longer continue. He slowly lowered the letter and covered his face with both hands. The entire ballroom remained silent. After several long moments, he walked down from the stage and stopped directly in front of Elijah. Without hesitation, he embraced the elderly black man who had quietly shaped every chapter of his life without ever asking for recognition. The applause that followed seemed endless. But before it could fully settle, one of the Pierce Foundation board members hurried onto the stage carrying a tablet. His face had turned completely pale. "Jonathan," he said nervously, "you need to see this immediately." Jonathan looked up. "What is it?" The board member swallowed hard before answering. "The anonymous donor account Mr. Brooks has been using for decades." He paused, struggling to believe the numbers himself. "It's completely empty." The ballroom instantly fell silent again. Jonathan slowly turned toward Elijah. "You gave away everything?" The ballroom became so silent that the soft ticking of the enormous antique clock above the stage could be heard throughout the hall. Jonathan Pierce stared at the board member, convinced he had misunderstood. "What did you just say?" The board member swallowed nervously before placing the tablet on the podium. Financial records appeared across the giant LED screen, each one verified by independent auditors only minutes earlier. Every account belonging to the Brooks Legacy Foundation had been reviewed. Every charitable trust had been traced. Every investment portfolio had been examined. At the bottom of the report, a single number appeared beside the foundation's available balance: 27,414. A wave of disbelief swept across the ballroom. Jonathan slowly turned toward Elijah. "No. That's impossible." Elijah simply smiled. "Numbers have a funny way of telling the truth." Jonathan shook his head. "You donated $6 billion. Elijah nodded. "Over many years." Jonathan's voice trembled. "You paid for this entire gala?" "Yes." "You funded hospitals?" "Yes." "Scholarships?" "Yes." "Yes." "Veterans housing?" "Yes." Jonathan looked as though he could barely breathe. "And now you have $27. Elijah quietly reached into his jacket pocket, removed an old leather wallet, and laughed softly. Actually, after paying the taxi tonight, he opened the wallet. "It's closer to 12. Nobody laughed. Several guests quietly wiped away tears. Jonathan looked toward Eleanor Carter, hoping someone would explain that this was all some terrible mistake. Eleanor slowly shook her head. "There isn't another account." Jonathan whispered, "What happened to your fortune?" Elijah answered honestly. "It became someone else's opportunity." Jonathan stood speechless. One of the reporters slowly raised her microphone. "Mr. Brooks." Her voice was almost shaking. "Why would anyone give away everything?" Elijah looked around the ballroom before replying. "Because money is only useful while it's moving." He paused. "The moment it sits still, it begins serving the wrong person." Complete silence returned. Jonathan slowly stepped closer. "Where do you live?" Elijah smiled. "A small apartment." "Do you own it?" Elijah shook his head. "I rent." Jonathan blinked in disbelief. "Your car?" Elijah laughed. "You saw my taxi." Gentle laughter spread through the audience, mixed with tears. Jonathan looked down ashamed. "You spent your life making sure strangers had homes." He paused. "While you never owned another one yourself." Elijah answered softly. "I only ever needed one room." The older security guard standing near the entrance quietly removed his cap. He had spent 25 years protecting wealthy people entering luxury buildings. Never once had he met a man who possessed so much while living with so little. Jonathan slowly asked another question. Do you have any family? Elijah's smile became smaller. Not anymore. Jonathan looked concerned. Children? Elijah lowered his eyes. My wife and I wanted children. He paused. Life had different plans. The room remained completely still. She passed away 22 years ago. Jonathan whispered, I'm so sorry. Elijah nodded gently. She believed giving was the best way to keep loving people after we were gone. Eleanor quietly added, every major donation made after her passing carried both their names, even though only Elijah signed the paperwork. Jonathan suddenly understood something. She agreed with all of this? Elijah smiled warmly. She encouraged it. He reached into his briefcase and removed an old photograph. It showed a younger Elijah standing beside a smiling black woman in a simple blue dress. Neither of them wore expensive clothes, yet both looked genuinely happy. Elijah carefully held the picture for a moment before returning it to the briefcase. She used to tell me something every morning. Jonathan listened carefully. What did she say? Elijah smiled through quiet emotion. If we can only make one person's life easier today, then today was worth living. Many people in the ballroom could no longer hide their tears. Amanda Collins quietly stepped toward the stage. Without saying a word, she removed the diamond necklace from around her neck and placed it on the charity auction table. One by one, other guests began doing the same. Expensive watches, designer bracelets, luxury handbags, rare jewelry, million-dollar paintings scheduled for private collections. Nobody announced what they were doing. Nobody asked permission. They simply walked forward and quietly placed valuable possessions onto the stage. Within minutes, the charity auction table overflowed with donations. Jonathan watched in amazement. What are they doing? Eleanor smiled softly. They're finally understanding your guest. Jonathan slowly looked toward Elijah. You changed this room. Elijah gently shook his head. No. He looked across the guests. Kindness was already here. He paused. Someone simply had to remind them. Just then, the hotel's general manager hurried into the ballroom carrying a small envelope. He looked around nervously before approaching Elijah. Mr. Brooks? Elijah nodded. Yes? The manager handed him the envelope. This was delivered to the front desk about 20 minutes ago. The messenger said it had to reach you tonight. Elijah looked surprised. Did he leave a name? No, sir. Elijah slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note and a cashier's check. His expression changed immediately. Jonathan noticed. What is it? Elijah quietly unfolded the note. His hands trembled for the very first time that evening. He read only the first sentence before falling completely silent. Jonathan looked at Eleanor. Who sent it? Eleanor stared at the signature at the bottom of the page, and her eyes widened in disbelief. She whispered only 4 words. I thought he was dead. The ballroom remained completely silent as Elijah Brooks stared at the handwritten note. For the first time that evening, the calm expression that had never left his face completely disappeared. His hands trembled ever so slightly. Jonathan Pierce noticed immediately. Elijah. Who sent it? Elijah did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on the signature at the bottom of the page. Eleanor Carter slowly stepped closer. She looked over his shoulder, and the color drained from her face. She whispered almost inaudibly, I thought he died 25 years ago. Jonathan looked between them in confusion. Who? Eleanor took a slow breath. Marcus Washington. The name meant nothing to most people in the ballroom, but Elijah immediately closed his eyes. He smiled sadly. He's alive. The hotel manager looked puzzled. The messenger only said the sender had waited a very long time for tonight. Elijah carefully unfolded the rest of the letter. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by an elderly man. He began reading silently before Jonathan gently asked, Would you read it to us? Elijah hesitated for several moments before nodding. His voice remained calm despite the emotion in his eyes. "Dear Elijah, if this letter reaches you, then you finally kept the promise we made all those years ago. I watched tonight's broadcast from a hospital room. You still wear the same old suit. You still refuse recognition. You are still the most stubborn man I have ever known." Gentle laughter quietly spread through the ballroom. Elijah smiled. "That sounds like Marcus." He continued reading. "Do you remember the winter we slept inside the abandoned church basement because neither of us had enough money to rent an apartment? You shared your last loaf of bread with me, even though I knew you were just as hungry." Jonathan listened carefully. He had never heard this part of Elijah's life. Elijah continued, "You told me something that changed my life forever. You said a man is not measured by what he keeps, but by what he leaves behind in other people." Elijah paused. His voice grew softer. "I never forgot those words." Tears quietly rolled down Eleanor Carter's face. Elijah continued reading. "You probably never realized this, but 35 years ago, when I started my construction company, every success I achieved came from the kindness you first showed me. I wanted to thank you many times, but you always disappeared before anyone could." The ballroom remained perfectly still. Elijah reached the second page. 3 years ago, the doctors told me I had little time left. My only regret was never repaying the debt I owed my oldest friend. So I spent those years quietly searching for every charitable foundation you ever created." Jonathan looked toward the cashier's check still resting inside the envelope. Elijah continued, "I discovered something that made me smile. Every foundation account was nearly empty because you had already given everything away." Elijah quietly laughed through tears. "That sounds about right." The audience smiled with him. He unfolded the final page. "You once told me kindness should never expect repayment. I know you'll refuse this gift if I call it gratitude. So instead, think of it as a promise finally being kept." Elijah slowly picked up the cashier's check. Jonathan stepped closer. "How much is it?" Elijah silently handed it to him. Jonathan's eyes widened the instant he saw the amount. His breathing stopped. $10 billion. The ballroom erupted into astonished whispers. Reporters looked at one another in disbelief. Even Eleanor Carter appeared overwhelmed. Jonathan looked back at Elijah. "This is impossible." Elijah quietly shook his head. "Marcus always did everything bigger than necessary." Jonathan examined the memo line written beneath the amount. Instead of donation, it simply read returning what was never mine. Elijah smiled sadly. He remembered. Jonathan looked at him. "What do you mean?" Elijah gazed toward the ceiling as old memories returned. 45 years ago, Marcus wanted to leave school because he couldn't afford tuition. He paused. "I paid his first semester." Jonathan looked shocked. "Just one semester?" Elijah nodded. "That was all I could afford." Eleanor smiled through tears. "That one semester eventually became the largest construction company in the country." The ballroom remained silent. Jonathan slowly looked down at the $10 billion check. "After everything you've done," his voice trembled, "you're rich again." Elijah smiled gently before taking the check back into his own hands. He looked at it for several long moments. Then, without saying a word, he walked toward the charity podium. Every camera followed him. Jonathan frowned. "Elijah?" Elijah picked up a pen lying beside the donation ledger. He quietly signed the back of the cashier's check. Jonathan suddenly realized what he was doing. "No." Elijah handed the endorsed check directly to Jonathan. "The children's hospitals still need building." Jonathan stared at him in disbelief. "You're donating it?" Elijah smiled warmly. "It never belonged to me." Complete silence filled the ballroom. Many guests openly wept. Jonathan looked down at the endorsed check worth $10 billion, then back at the elderly black man who once again had chosen to walk away with almost nothing. Before Jonathan could say another word, the ballroom doors slowly opened one final time. A young woman wearing a doctor's white coat stepped quietly inside. holding a small framed photograph in her hands. She looked directly at Elijah, smiled through tears, and softly said, "Mr. Brooks, I've spent my entire life searching for the man who saved my father's future." The ballroom doors slowly opened as every conversation came to an immediate stop. The young black woman standing in the doorway looked no older than 30. She wore a white physician's coat over an elegant evening dress and clutched a small wooden picture frame tightly against her chest. Tears already filled her eyes before she had spoken another word. Every camera turned toward her. Jonathan Pierce looked at the unfamiliar woman with confusion. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" She smiled politely without taking her eyes off Elijah Brooks. "My name is Dr. Maya Washington." Elijah's gentle smile immediately widened. "Marcus, little girl." Maya nodded as tears rolled down her cheeks. "I'm not so little anymore." The ballroom quietly laughed through the emotion. Elijah slowly walked toward her. "The last time I saw you," he paused, smiling at the memory. "You were sitting on your father's shoulders because you couldn't see the Christmas parade." Maya laughed softly. "I was 5 years old." Elijah nodded. "You kept asking whether Santa accepted hugs instead of letters." More gentle laughter echoed through the ballroom. Maya wiped away a tear before carefully holding out the framed photograph. "I've carried this picture with me since I graduated from medical school." Elijah accepted it with both hands. The faded photograph showed 3 people standing in front of a tiny construction site more than 30 years earlier. A young Marcus Washington stood proudly beside his wife, while Elijah knelt beside a little girl wearing oversized safety goggles and a bright yellow construction helmet. Written across the bottom in faded ink were the words, "Dream big, little builder. One day you'll build lives instead of buildings." "Elijah." Jonathan quietly smiled. "You became a doctor instead." Maya nodded. Because of him, she looked toward the audience. "When I was 12 years old, my father finally told me who paid for his education." She looked at Elijah. "He also told me the man who changed his life never wanted anyone to know." Elijah smiled shyly. "Marcus talked too much." The ballroom laughed again. Maya continued. "My father spent decades trying to repay that kindness." She glanced toward the $10 billion check resting on the podium. "He always knew you'd give the money away again." Jonathan looked surprised. "He knew?" Maya smiled. "He told me yesterday. Elijah will probably donate every penny before sunrise." Even Eleanor Carter laughed quietly. Elijah shrugged with a smile. "He knew me too well." Maya reached into her handbag and removed another envelope. Unlike the previous one, it bore the official seal of the Washington Family Foundation. "My father expected exactly what you just did." Elijah looked at the envelope with curiosity. "What's this?" Maya smiled through fresh tears. "Plan B." Jonathan laughed in disbelief. "He had a plan B." Maya nodded. "He said if you donated the $10 billion, you'd probably leave yourself with nothing again." She handed the envelope to Elijah. "So he made this legally impossible." Elijah slowly opened the envelope. Inside rested a certified legal agreement. Eleanor Carter adjusted her glasses before reading over his shoulder. Her eyes widened. "Marcus." She looked up in amazement. "You unbelievable man." Jonathan stepped closer. "What is it?" Eleanor smiled. 3 years ago, Marcus established an irrevocable living trust." Jonathan frowned. "For Elijah?" Eleanor nodded. "Every month for the rest of Elijah's life, the trust automatically provides housing, healthcare, transportation, and every living expense imaginable." Jonathan smiled. "Can Elijah refuse it?" Eleanor quietly shook her head. "No." The ballroom erupted with warm laughter. Elijah looked almost offended. "He trapped me." Maya laughed through tears. "He said you'd argue." Elijah folded documents carefully before smiling toward the ceiling. "You finally won one, Marcus." Maya looked at him lovingly. "He said kindness deserves to grow old with dignity." Complete silence returned. Jonathan looked toward Elijah. "After everything you've done for everyone else," He smiled warmly. Someone finally figured out how to take care of you. Elijah quietly nodded. Apparently so. Just then, the master of ceremonies stepped nervously onto the stage. He had completely abandoned the original schedule hours earlier. Looking across the ballroom, he smiled awkwardly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he paused. "I don't believe anyone still remembers the purpose of tonight's program." Gentle laughter filled the room. Jonathan slowly walked back to the podium. Actually, he smiled toward Elijah. "I think we finally discovered it." He looked across the hundreds of guests. Tonight was never about raising money. He paused. It was about remembering why we raise it in the first place. Thunderous applause echoed throughout the ballroom. Employees stood beside billionaires. Waiters applauded beside governors. Television crews forgot they were working. For nearly 2 full minutes, no one spoke. They simply applauded the quiet black man who had spent an entire lifetime changing lives without asking for recognition. Finally, as the applause slowly faded, one of the foundation's senior accountants hurried onto the stage carrying an old leather ledger covered in dust. He looked directly at Jonathan. "Sir, while searching the archives, we found something else." Jonathan accepted the heavy book. Across the front cover, written in faded gold lettering, were 4 simple words. "Founding donors, 1989. Curious, he slowly opened the first page. The handwriting was elegant and neatly organized. The very first name listed was not Jonathan Pierce. It was not Marcus Washington. It was not any billionaire or famous philanthropist. Jonathan stared at the first line in complete disbelief before slowly looking toward Elijah. His voice barely emerged above a whisper. "You founded this charity." The ballroom fell silent once again as Jonathan turned the page and discovered a secret that had been hidden since the very first day the foundation had ever existed. The ballroom fell into complete silence as Jonathan Pierce stared at the first page of the worn leather ledger. The gold letters across the top read, "Founding donors, 1989. But it was the first handwritten entry that stole the breath from everyone standing nearby. The very first donor listed was Elijah Brooks. Next to his name appeared the amount of $217.1443, followed by a handwritten note in faded ink, "Entire life savings donated to open the first neighborhood food pantry." Jonathan slowly looked up, unable to speak. He turned another page. The second donor had contributed $100. The third had given $50. The fourth had donated $25. Yet Elijah's contribution remained the largest. Jonathan whispered, "You gave everything you had." Elijah smiled gently. "Back then it wasn't very much." Jonathan shook his head. "It was everything." Eleanor Carter carefully accepted the ledger and continued turning the fragile pages. Every major chapter of the Foundation's history was recorded there. Whenever the organization nearly closed because donations disappeared, Elijah's name quietly appeared again. Sometimes the amount was $500, sometimes $5,000, years later $50,000, then hundreds of thousands, eventually millions. Every crisis had the same solution. Every rescue had the same anonymous signature. Jonathan looked around the ballroom. "This foundation," his voice trembled, "exists because of you." Elijah quietly replied, "It exists because people kept believing in one another." Jonathan turned another page. Near the center of the ledger, an old newspaper clipping had been carefully preserved beneath clear protective film. The headline read, "Neighborhood Food Pantry Saved After Anonymous Donation." The article praised volunteers who had worked tirelessly to feed struggling families, but mentioned nothing about the donor's identity. Jonathan smiled sadly. "You even hid from the newspapers back then." Elijah laughed softly. "Journalists asked too many questions." Gentle laughter spread throughout the ballroom. The atmosphere had become lighter, yet the emotion remained overwhelming. One of the younger reporters stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Brooks." Elijah looked at her kindly. "Yes? I've covered charity events for 7 years. She paused. Every major donor I've ever interviewed wanted their name on a building, a scholarship, or a press release. She smiled through tears. You're the first person I've met who spent an entire lifetime trying to raise his own name. Elijah answered simply. The people receiving help never asked what my name was. Silence returned. Jonathan carefully closed the old ledger before walking to the center of the stage. He looked across the hundreds of guests filling the ballroom. Tonight I planned to celebrate the success of the Pierce Foundation. He paused. I've just discovered that I was standing inside someone else's dream. He slowly turned toward Elijah. You built this long before I ever arrived. Elijah shook his head gently. I only planted seeds. Jonathan smiled. Then generations have been living in the forest you planted. Thunderous applause erupted once again. Employees stood beside executives. Governors applauded beside hotel staff. Several musicians quietly wiped tears from their faces before joining the applause. It lasted nearly 3 full minutes. When the room finally became quiet again, Jonathan picked up the microphone once more. I have one final announcement. Every guest listened carefully. Beginning tomorrow morning, the Pierce Foundation will officially change its name. Elijah immediately shook his head. Jonathan? Jonathan smiled. Please let me finish. He looked toward the audience. For years, I believed leadership meant being remembered. He glanced at Elijah. Tonight, I learned leadership means making sure someone else is remembered. He slowly unfolded a prepared legal document that one of the attorneys had hurriedly revised during the evening. Pending board approval, our organization will become the Brooks Foundation for Human Dignity. The ballroom erupted into another standing ovation. Elijah quietly lowered his head. I don't deserve that. Jonathan laughed softly. That's exactly why you do. Before Elijah could answer, Eleanor Carter gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Accept it. Elijah looked at her. Eleanor smiled warmly. Not for yourself. She glanced around the ballroom. For every child who will one day ask who Brooks was. Elijah remained silent. Jonathan continued speaking. Every scholarship, every hospital, every food pantry, every emergency shelter we build from this day forward will remind people of one simple truth. He looked directly at Elijah. One ordinary act of kindness can outlive every fortune ever earned. The applause slowly settled into quiet emotion. At that moment, the elderly hotel concierge who had worked at the Grand Imperial for nearly 40 years cautiously approached the stage carrying a small, dusty cardboard box. Excuse me, Mr. Brooks. Elijah turned. Yes? The concierge smiled apologetically. While cleaning an old storage room this afternoon, we found this package. He handed it to Elijah. It has your name on it. Elijah looked surprised. My name? The concierge nodded. According to the label, it has been waiting here for 31 years. Curious murmurs spread across the ballroom. Elijah slowly brushed away the dust covering the lid. Written in faded black marker were 7 words that instantly made his hands tremble. For Elijah, open, only after. They finally understand. Beneath the message appeared a familiar signature. Margaret Brooks, Elijah's late wife. The room became silent once again as tears filled his eyes. He whispered almost to himself. She knew this day would come. The thunderous applause slowly faded as every eye turned toward the elderly employee standing near the front row. His weathered hands held an old dented metal lunchbox, its faded blue paint chipped by decades of use. Samuel Reed stared at it without moving. For the first time that evening, genuine surprise crossed his face. He slowly walked down from the stage until he stood only a few feet away. Thomas? He asked softly. The old man smiled through tears. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. Samuel laughed quietly and embraced him. How could I forget? Thomas gently placed the lunchbox into Samuel's hands. I've kept it for 48 years. I always believed one day I'd be able to return it. Samuel carefully brushed his fingers across the scratched lid before opening it. Inside rested a faded cloth napkin, a rusted house key, and a folded $5 bill sealed inside yellowed plastic. Richard Bennett stepped closer, confused. "What is this?" Thomas looked toward the audience before speaking. 48 years ago, I was the youngest machine operator in the company. My wife has given birth to our first daughter. When Bennett Global nearly collapsed, we had no money left. I came to work every day pretending everything was fine, because I was too ashamed to admit my family hadn't eaten in 2 days. Complete silence filled the ballroom. Thomas continued. "One morning, I found this lunch box sitting beside my machine." He smiled faintly. Inside was a sandwich, an apple, $5, and a note. Samuel quietly lowered his eyes. Thomas unfolded the tiny piece of paper that had remained inside the lunchbox for nearly half a century. Though faded with age, the handwriting was still visible. He read it aloud. "Until things get better, please don't tell anyone you need help, and please don't tell anyone who helped you. Someday, when someone else is struggling, simply do the same for them." Thomas looked at Samuel with tears streaming down his face. There was no signature. He paused. But I recognized the handwriting years later. Every person in the ballroom became so quiet that even the television cameras seemed to stop moving. Elijah Brooks stared at the dusty cardboard box resting in his hands. 31 years. It had waited inside the Grand Imperial Hotel longer than some of the younger employees working there had been alive. His fingers slowly brushed across the faded handwriting on the lid. For Elijah, open only after they finally understand. Beneath the message was the signature he had not seen in more than 2 decades. Margaret Brooks. Jonathan Pierce stepped closer but said nothing. Eleanor Carter quietly wiped away tears before whispering, "She planned this before she passed away." Elijah nodded slowly. "Margaret always planned further ahead than I did." Gentle laughter drifted through the ballroom before fading into silence once more. Elijah carefully untied the old string around the box. Inside rested a neatly folded blue sweater, a worn family Bible, a faded photograph of Elijah and Margaret standing in front of their first apartment, and a sealed envelope resting on top of everything else. Written across the envelope were 4 simple words: "My final conversation." Elijah smiled sadly. She always knew I'd read the letter last. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope. The paper inside was perfectly preserved. He unfolded it and began reading aloud. "My dear Elijah, if this letter has finally reached you, then people have at last discovered what I always knew. They have learned that your greatest gift was never your money. It was your heart." Elijah paused as emotion overwhelmed him. The ballroom remained perfectly still. He continued, "I know you. By the time you read this, you will have already given away everything again. You probably arrived in the same old suit because you refused to buy another one. You probably thanked the waiters before anyone thanked you. And you probably tried to leave before anyone could applaud." Soft laughter mixed with tears echoed across the room. Margaret knew him perfectly. Elijah smiled through watery eyes before continuing. "People often asked me whether I was upset that you gave away so much. They never understood that I never lost anything. Every child who smiled because of your kindness became part of our family. Every student who graduated. Every patient who recovered. Every homeless veteran who found a bed. Every hungry family who found a meal. Those were the children we never had." Many guests openly cried. Maya Washington quietly held Eleanor's hand. Jonathan lowered his head. Elijah continued reading. "One day people will probably try to honor you. Please don't spend your energy telling them they are wrong. Let them celebrate kindness instead. They aren't really celebrating you. They're celebrating the possibility that ordinary people can still change the world." Elijah turned to the final page. His voice became almost a whisper. "I have only one last request. When your own journey is finally over, don't let them remember how much money you donated. Don't let them remember how many buildings carry your name. Let them remember that every person deserves dignity before judgment. If they remember that, then we will have lived a beautiful life together." Elijah slowly lowered the letter. Tears rolled silently down his face. He looked toward the ceiling and smiled. "We did, Margaret." The ballroom stood as one. No announcement asked them to rise. No orchestra played. Every guest simply stood in silent respect. Jonathan Pierce walked toward Elijah, carrying the old ledger in one hand and Margaret's letter in the other. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "there's one final decision that belongs only to you." Elijah looked at him. Jonathan smiled warmly. "What would you like the world to remember?" Elijah thought for a long moment, before gently shaking his head. "Not me." He looked across the ballroom at the waiters, security guards, receptionists, cleaners, photographers, accountants, volunteers, and young employees standing beside billionaires and politicians. "Remember them." He pointed toward the catering employee who had dropped the crystal plates earlier that evening. "He reminded me that everyone deserves a second chance." He pointed toward the older security guard. "He chose respect before authority." He looked toward Amanda Collins. "She had the courage to admit she was wrong." Then he smiled at Jonathan. "And he proved that people can still grow after success." Jonathan nodded through tears. "Then that's what we'll remember." The following morning, newspapers across the country expected headlines about the $10 billion donation, the renamed foundation, and the record-breaking charity gala. Instead, every major newspaper chose the same photograph. It showed no billionaires, no celebrities, and no luxury ballroom. It showed an elderly black man in an old charcoal gray suit kneeling beside a frightened catering employee, quietly helping him pick up broken pieces of crystal from the marble floor. Beneath the photograph appeared a single headline that millions of readers would never forget. "The greatest man in the room was the first to kneel." In the years that followed, the Brooks Foundation for Human Dignity funded hospitals, schools, food banks, shelters, and scholarships across the nation. Yet the most visited place inside its headquarters was not a museum or a memorial. It was a small hallway where three simple objects rested beneath glass: an old paper invitation, a worn leather briefcase, and the handwritten note once hidden inside a lunch box. Beside them hung one sentence that became the Foundation's promise to every future generation: "Before you ask who someone is, ask how you can treat them with dignity." And those who knew the full story understood that the greatest legacy Elijah Brooks ever left behind was not measured in billions of dollars. It was measured in the countless ordinary people who chose kindness when nobody was watching. Ogade toward Samuel. He smiled gently. "I had forgotten about the note." Thomas shook his head. "I never did." He slowly turned toward the audience. "That $5 bought milk for my daughter." His voice broke. "She's a pediatric surgeon today." A ripple of emotion spread through the room. Thomas continued. "When she graduated from medical school, I told her the story of the unknown man who fed our family. She promised to treat every child whose parents couldn't afford care." He smiled proudly. "She has never sent a bill to a single family in need." Samuel quietly closed the lunchbox. "You didn't owe me anything." Thomas smiled. "Exactly." He looked around the ballroom. "That's why kindness keeps multiplying." No one applauded. Many people simply cried. Richard Bennett slowly stepped back onto the stage. He looked across the hundreds of employees gathered before him. For the first time in his career, he ignored the prepared speech waiting on the podium. "Tonight," he said quietly, "I was supposed to announce the biggest business deal in our company's history." He looked toward Samuel. "Instead, I discovered the greatest investment was made almost 50 years ago with a sandwich, an apple, and $5. Gentle laughter mixed with tears echoed through the ballroom. Richard continued. "Beginning tomorrow, Bennett Global will no longer measure success only by revenue, market share, or quarterly profit." He turned toward the board members seated near the front. "Every executive bonus will now be tied equally to employee well-being, ethical leadership, and community impact." The board members stood together and nodded in agreement. Richard then faced the employees once more. And every new employee hired by this company will hear Thomas's story on their very first day. Thunderous applause erupted throughout the ballroom. Samuel quietly tried to slip away, while everyone focused on the stage, but Margaret Ellis noticed him moving toward the exit. She smiled knowingly. Still avoiding attention, Samuel laughed. Old habits. Richard hurried after him before he could leave. Samuel turned. Richard held out the old lunchbox. I think this belongs in our museum. Samuel gently pushed it back toward Thomas. No. He smiled warmly. It belongs with the family whose future it helped build. Thomas accepted it with trembling hands. Samuel then looked one last time across the magnificent ballroom. Executives were shaking hands with janitors. Reporters were interviewing receptionists instead of celebrities. Board members were thanking waiters who had served dinner all evening. The atmosphere had completely changed. Samuel smiled quietly. William would have liked this. Without another word, he picked up his worn leather briefcase and walked toward the ballroom doors exactly as he had entered earlier that evening, alone, unnoticed by many, and perfectly content with that. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the cameras remained inside covering the celebration. No reporters followed him. No photographers asked for one final picture. Samuel preferred it that way. He climbed into an ordinary taxi and disappeared into the city lights. The following morning, every newspaper carried headlines about the historic $5 billion investment and the transformation of Bennett Global into the nation's largest employee-owned corporation. Yet the headline most people remembered was much simpler. The quiet guest everyone ignored paid for everything. Years later, visitors entering Bennett Global headquarters would find no bronze statue of Samuel Reed. Instead, hanging quietly in the main lobby was a small framed copy of the handwritten note once hidden inside an old lunch box. When someone else is struggling, simply do the same for them. Beneath it appeared no signature, only one sentence that became the company's guiding principle forever. Great companies are built by ordinary people who choose kindness when no one is watching. And every employee who walked past those words understood that the greatest legacy was never the billions of dollars the company earned, but the countless lives changed by one man who believed the smallest act of compassion could outlive